Hello, everyone. Welcome to this series of interviews with cybersecurity experts at Cyen. I'm Eva Tasheva, your host, and today we have Steve Purser. For those of you in information security, you know Steve, he doesn't need introduction, but if you have not had the pleasure to meet him yet, he is very senior executive in information security with over 30 years of experience. Probably before information security was a thing, Steve was already busy with it. He was currently is a cybersecurity consultant. So if you need help, you can reach out to him. But he's also former head of core operation department at ENISA and also director of Clearstream. He goes back also being the head of information security at Banque Générale Luxembourg, BNL. You see it already, very diverse experience and very extensive experience. This is why we invited Steve to share some very particular topic that not everyone has yet had the chance to experience, so we can learn from his own experience. How do we steer Dora, the Digital Operation Resilience Act, which probably you know focus on operation resilience of the financial sector? How do we steer this new European regulation on cybersecurity at the boardroom? Thank you, Steve, for being with us. Without further ado, I would like to ask you maybe just the first basic question. Much has happened in terms of developing information security and how each role interacts and what are the responsibilities of the different roles within compliance. But from your perspective, what is the role of the C-level and of board of directors in Dora?
Okay, so first of all, good morning, Eva. Thank you very much for the invitation today. I think when you look at the text, the term management body is the one that's used throughout the text. And this is actually defined in Article 3 by reference to other pieces of legislation. My reading of the text is that the management body is not necessarily one board. It could be several boards. If they are playing an active role in managing the organization, they can be considered as part of the management body. So the main responsibilities of the management body are detailed in Article 5. But the bottom line is really that the management body is expected to be truly in control. And I really mean truly in control. So it's not a question of delegating to senior staff. It's really at their level of abstraction, of course. They need to know what's going on and they need to be sufficiently involved in the work to be able to make the decisions they need to make. Sounds obvious, but of course, cybersecurity is quite specialized, so getting this level of abstraction might be difficult. The exact words are that the management body shall define, approve, oversee, and be responsible for the ICT risk management framework, and they bear ultimate responsibility. So it makes a lot of sense. The management body needs to know what risks the organization is coping with. They need to have a good understanding, and they need to have a good understanding of what actions have been put in place to deal with these risks, and at any moment where we are in the process of mitigating these risks. You do have some specific things mentioned. I'll just go through them very quickly. So if you go further down in the text, you see that they need to put policies in place, nothing surprising there. Establishing governance, clear roles and responsibilities. This is key. And I would advise organizations to be very careful here. So multiple responsibilities is good as long as you know who is responsible for doing what, so you don't have shared responsibilities that ping pong between each other. There is setting and improving the digital operational risk strategy. We'll come back to that later probably. There's the need to approve, oversee and review the ICT response and recovery plan, audits, budget and resources. So all the things you would expect a management body to be doing. Last but not least, the management body is expected to keep itself up to date. So it's expected to maintain a certain level of knowledge, again, at its level, of course, about what is going on and how they are dealing with it. So Dora and NIS2 actually put a lot of responsibility on the management body, and we've seen what the management body is. And I personally think this is a nice evolution. because they really need to be implicated a lot more in perhaps in the implementation than they have been in the past, perhaps.
Indeed, so this is, I see some parallels with the NIS2 directive, so another major legislation in the EU coming into play now in October across the EU. And there again, the first articles of governance is like management, high-level management responsibility. They need to set the framework for risk, they need to control it, and they're eventually liable if anything happens. And it comes with experience, right? We all know in security in the past, you would have a good objectives for security, but then the actual projects would be on the back burner. It was, of course, business first, clients first, and security was well intended, but not always well invested. And this is indeed where you could get the investment from the management, from board of directors. And this is why we probably regulators have targeted them to take the responsibility and enable the necessary resources. But it's one thing to set up the governance, but one thing we need to be clear about is what are the objectives. So being able to distribute the responsibility comes, of course, from the internal business organization, but all of us, eventually, we must follow the same objectives. This is the point of regulation. What are the key objectives to achieve with Dora?
Okay, so there are, broadly speaking, 4 areas of focus in Dora. The first is a set of requirements on IT systems, on ICT systems themselves. There are requirements on contractual relationships with third-party ICT service providers, and this is a very important part of the legislation, I believe. So this is making sure, it's a bit like supply chain. It's making sure that the whole stream of events that to keep a company going is secured. There's a powerful oversight framework, particularly for this third-party involvement. And so, yeah, what are the key objectives to achieve? Well, if you look at the legislation itself, there are 4 areas of focus, essentially. One is requirements on ICT systems. One is requirements on contractual relations with third-party ICT service providers. And this, I think, is a very important part of the legislation. Can be compared to some extent with the notion, I think, of supply chain in NIS2. So it's making sure that the whole chain of processing, if you like, is secured correctly. There's a very powerful oversight framework defined for overseeing the relationships with third-party ICT service providers. And there's the fourth, I think, objective at the level of the legislation is setting goals for cooperation and supervision. But again, it's really all about ensuring that financial entities have a high common level of operational resilience. And it's all about risk management. And when you look at what's required of the financial entity themselves, you see this. So the big things that financial entities need to be sure of, they need a strong ICT risk management framework. And that involves things like not only understanding what the risks are and setting up risk mitigation actions, but dealing with residual risk, for instance. So you never completely mitigate a risk or it's unusual. So that residual risk needs to be identified and it needs to be signed off by the right person. And that right person is not the security officer, it's the business officer. Well, this is usually the case anyway. So the risk management framework is super important. Then, of course, you've got requirements on incident management, classification and reporting. Digital operation resilience testing, which is strongly linked with what the European Central Bank did a few years ago with the EU Cyber effort. I think this is a nice development. We might talk about that later. There's managing this third-party ICT risk, and there's the question of information sharing. So again, these are just separate facets of the most important thing, that an organization must genuinely be in control. We put a lot of emphasis on the management body, but of course it goes for all levels of the organization. So this involves a lot of training, a lot of user awareness, a lot of getting people to talk to each other and making sure that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing.
This comes across often when we discuss Dora, that is about a very comprehensive program that everyone in the organization is impacted. one way or another, directly or indirectly. And here again, the board role is to come up and to coordinate, to make sure that all the objectives are equally followed or achieved across the organization. And yes, indeed, as you sum it up, it's about increasing security according to your risk, but also taking into consideration your suppliers. So it's not only about us, it's also about who we work with. And this usually it's a difficult area to manage, because we've been used to be driven just by convenience, by the price, by the offer. Now we also have to consider security in this relationship with suppliers. This is one of the challenges I could think of, and we also discussed extensively in a video on supply chain, software supply chain security. But what are the other challenges, Steve, that you see specifically for the board in implementing Dora regulation?
Okay, look, I think the challenges are not new. They've been with us for many, many years. And it sometimes astounds me, as being a practitioner who's been here a long while, how we continually trip up over the same things. And these tend to be rather basic things. So the challenges, as I see them, are first of all understanding that missions before we've really understood the problem. And of course, understanding doesn't come in one go. It's an iterative process as you start doing a way of doing it, etc. So again, I think what the EU regulators were trying to achieve here is genuine risk management, not compliance. I'm not saying that compliance is not important, but I think that, and this is a theme in cybersecurity regulation and legislation, that we are looking for risk management moving forward. And again, this is back to what we just said, that really all levels of the organization need to be involved. And that's the job of the management board, setting up the governance system and making sure that it really works. So, and this involves very trivial things, but again, this is where people really trip up. Like, for instance, if you went to any staff member and you asked them where the security policy is or what certain procedures do, can they find it? Sounds very simple. Quite often they cannot. And then if you do find it, is it reasonable? Is it a 30-page document, which is very difficult to follow? Or is it something short and sharp, which has been regularly updated, which reflects reality and which can really work, in the face of an incident, for instance? Achieving this effective governance system in different disciplines to talk to each other. I think, for instance, what we've seen in EU legislation over the last few years is there's been a strong legal component and a strong IT component. So it's obvious that the Chief Information Security Officer needs to be able to sustain a meaningful dialogue with not only the head of compliance, but the legal people. And they need to be understanding each other's terminology and making sure that they are working forward hand in hand and not working against each other, as it were. So I think these are some of the biggest challenges, but there are some traditional ones as well. Balancing people, process, and technology is one that quite often comes up. I still see and feel very strongly that people put too much reliance on technology. Technology is good, but if you don't have the right process behind it, and if you don't have people who are educated to use it properly, it can cause more harm than good, because you put too much reliance on it and then things go wrong. So this balancing of people, process, and technology is another thing to look out for. And tools never do the whole job. You need to have people behind them making sure that they themselves behave and are delivering what they are supposed to deliver. So at the end of the day, I think a lot of Dora is about ensuring practical controls that work in the real world. So I've mentioned that short, sharp documents are one thing. People need to be able to know where to find things. You need to test things as well. This is something that I think is obviously becoming more and more topical, especially after the recent event that we had with the software update. How many people test their business continuity plans, or indeed test their software? Testing is absolutely critical. And if you don't do it, probably you're going to get into trouble. I think these are the major challenges.
Indeed, just the testing is so important, so crucial, and still so difficult to get, we're having another video which deep dives into the resilience testing, how to do it, how to test it without breaking it, right? This is always the risk when you go in a test, that you are going to push the borders, and what if the instruments that you have in place don't work out? Then you have an incident, how to prevent this and how to strategize the tests.
Right.
This is in another of our videos. We discussed already the balancing act. We discussed the roles, responsibility, the governance, and the know your risk and how you handle it. What if boards or C-level don't get it? What if they don't subscribe to it? What if they don't act upon the risks? What are the liabilities linked to security and compliance and non-compliance actually for a board?
Mm-hmm. So I think penalties are quite severe. The interesting articles here, for those who want to go and look them up in the legislation, are 35 when it comes to third-party providers, 42, and then 50 and 52. So Article 35 basically states that a penalty of up to 1% of average daily turnover can be imposed on a non-compliant service provider on a daily basis up to 6 months. So this is really quite a strong penalty. And Article 42 goes on to state that competent authorities may take a decision requiring financial entities to temporarily suspend the use of a third-party service, or indeed to terminate the contract. And you can imagine what that could do to an entity's ability to operate. So if you are forced to suspend the contract or to terminate a contract with an essential third-party supplier, you're going to have difficulties, I think. So in this sense, penalties are really quite hard. Now, if you go to the Article 50 and 51, this is more concerning the entities themselves. So Article 50, which is administrative penalties and remedial measures, it empowers any type of measure, including, so again, this is quite strong. And it's so then we can progress to Articles 50 and 52. So Article 50 is administrative penalties and remedial measures, and this applies to the financial entity itself, and it empowers competent authorities to adopt any type of measure. Now, this is really significant, and this is really up to the member states to decide what that means. It can include pecuniary measures, and they can adopt any kind of measure to ensure that financial entities comply. And in particular here, if you look at paragraph 5, it clarifies that administrative measures can be applied to members of the management body. So this is also bringing back this constant theme that the management body is being responsibilized, and there can be personal consequences for this. And then if you move on to Article 52, it deals with criminal penalties. Obviously, this is dependent on national law, but criminal penalties are, of course, possible. So if you put them all together, it's quite strong. So there's a big dose of how much member states want to enforce this and what they think is reasonable and what they don't think is reasonable. But I think the underlying message is quite clear, that financial entities are required to take this very seriously, and if they don't, there could be quite far-reaching consequences. Now, that's the legal side of things, but don't let us forget that the reputational side is always, I think, the most important. So organizations that are seen not to be complying with Dora are going to, I think, raise a big question mark with their clients, which is normal. Yeah? You're expected to be at least as good as your peers, if not better. And I think this is a thing which will also start to play quite strongly in the marketplace, especially after the recent incidents we've seen, and this is not going to stop. So I think clients in general are going to look for more and more secure environments. So Dora non-compliance, I think, will have quite hefty consequences for financial institutions.
Indeed. So this is the same situation again with NIS, who again very much focus liability directly imposed on the management. Again, you have to take serious. When I speak with companies, we mostly work with NIS too, up until now, of course, Dora now coming into play. They always tell me, you know what, money, it's a business. Usually banks ICT providers, they're successful businesses, you could pay the penalty. That is not the problem. The real problem is reputation.
Right.
And it's clients for the banks, obviously, but it's also partners. Would you imagine there's quite a complex supply chain? There are also imagine the Visa, imagine the MasterCard, all these relationship, which are relationship, and one has to really preserve it. Significant hit could come from potential non-compliance with such a significant, and I would say also basic law, right? Really the law to do business with Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this environment, you do not want to be perceived as not being secure. That would be quite catastrophic as a financial institution.
Absolutely, I agree with you. So there are a lot of consequences of not compliance, but how can organization best prepare? How to avoid this worst case scenario? What does experience teach us, and more specifically, your experience?
Okay, so how can organizations best prepare for Dora? Well, I think I look upon Dora as formalizing something which should largely be already in place, with some exceptions, of course. There are some very specific things in Dora which will not have been captured, and they won't have been captured by certification schemes, etc. So organizations, of course, do have some work to do. I think the steps are, first of all, I mentioned it at the beginning of the interview, it's really worth putting a lot of effort into understanding not only the legislation, but also the impact of the legislation on your particular organization. And again, I make a plea to everybody, please don't copy others. It's always very tempting to try and do the same as other people are doing, therefore think you're safe. You've really got to think this out for yourself. And that exercise of thinking out things for yourself is actually what brings the benefits. So copying is not the right way to go. Again, practically, we've gone over it several times. Management bodies need to be aware of their responsibilities. They need to be genuinely in control. They need to feel in control. One thing I would say to anyone sitting on a management board, if you do not personally feel in control, there's a problem. You need to know that you are living up to your responsibilities. Therefore, you need to know what they are. You need to have the reporting system in place at your level to make sure that you can go to bed and sleep quietly at night. And again, that's not easy. Setting up the governance responsibilities, a governance system, we've been over that, getting to people talking to each other. I think the risk assessment is key. We've said it several times. So spend a lot of effort on this and make sure it's not a one-off. I mean, a risk assessment is never a one-off thing. It's something that you should be very regularly updating as risks evolve. That doesn't require as much work as you may think, as long as you don't make the periodicity too long. So it's really worth doing this. Don't reinvent the wheel. So when you start to look at Dora, take account of all the good things you've already done. That should be one of the first steps. I think this gap analysis, what does Dora expect, what you already have in place. And remember this comment I made about residual risk. This is something that organizations very often miss. They have no real mechanism for identifying and signing off residual risk. And this is hugely important. So an example, you have a risk, you set up a mechanism to deal with it, but you don't deal with it 100%. You've got this little bit left over at the end. Typically, the manager of the business line that's dealing with that risk will sign this off. And that's fine. Sometimes you cannot do better. You can even accept risks as long as you do so responsibly, and as long as your shareholders and all your other partners, etc., are aware of this. That's absolutely fine if the risk analysis justify it. But you need to show that you're in control and that you've thought of it and that it's not incidental. You need a simple tracking method, I think, at the management level. So you need something which tells you exactly what's been done, what is left to be done, by when it will be done, and again, this famous residual risk. And then last but not least, I think you should put a lot of effort into awareness training and security training across the enterprise. And let's not forget that not everybody has the same needs. So a global awareness training program is a good thing, but then it should be followed up by specialized programs. For instance, if you're developing in-house software, your developers need to know about how to develop secure software. And you need to know the risks of exposed test environments, et cetera, et cetera. So this is knowledge that's been with us for many, many years. But again, you'll be surprised how many times it does not get implemented. Nothing new here, but I think organizations will have to put the dots on the I's a lot more than perhaps they've done in the past.
Probably something that strikes me as the major change, and again, this is why we discuss the responsibility of board, is that up until now, I would go to a CEO, to a COO, and they would tell me, yes, we are fine. I have the security guy or girl taking care of it. They would not ask questions. They would not know what is happening. They would not know what are their open risks. Where do the money go? What risks they're patching? So this, I think, is the biggest change that comes with new regulation, especially responsibilizing the boards and the C-level, is that it could not be done, from scratches on the technical level.
Organically, yeah. Can I pick up on that, Eva? Because I think you mentioned an important point, and that's we came to this idea of testing, and testing is not always formalized testing. You can test something by asking the right questions. And I would encourage management board members not to hold back because their questions, they think they're not the right questions. Any question can be asked, and I think the more the merrier. There's no such thing as a stupid question. If you need to know something, you need to know it. So please do it.
Yes, and especially those that look the simplest. So don't assume people have
Exactly.
Ask the simplest questions. They're the most difficult to answer. And if your person that you put the responsibility with can answer the simplest questions, probably they would be able to also show you how they manage security. But this is, again, also what I wanted to share. Risk assessment, you say, right? People come with risk assessment here, there, accept, remediate. So boards and management is kind of placed on the hot seat to just take the responsibility, but they don't always understand the whole thinking behind. They cannot always, if they are going to make decisions, they have to challenge the assessment. They have to challenge whether what is presented to them is the best scenario. So, of course, as a security person, that makes our life a little bit more difficult. But in terms of security, it clearly improves the overall state of security. So then eventually if something happens, incident happen every day. If something happens, we know that we all collectively did the best.
Look, I think one rule you can use here as any kind of manager, but particularly as a high-level manager, is you only need to understand something to the point that enables you to make the decision you need to make.
Exactly.
So you do not need to go deeper. No one expects management people to understand the in and outs of the operating systems, etc. But it is your job, I think, to make sure that your staff are satisfying your requirements. If someone cannot make you personally feel comfortable that things are going right, then something is wrong. And this, of course, is the classic task of a CISO. I mean, CISOs are they are technical people, but even more, they are people. They need to have good communication skills. And if they cannot translate complex problems into the language of managers and business people, train them to do so, because it's really important.
And it's very good for building a relationship, right?
It is.
So one has to have a trust relationship, but also a relationship where you might feel confident to go constructive, right? Much of the frustration between CISOs and board come from miscommunication. CISOs don't feel understood or don't feel their message has passed through, but it's just about, as you say, proper communication, interpersonal communication, and that's also probably something that we really need to fix to be able to move forward with.
So there is another point here, Eva, as well, and that's, I think, to some extent, you're bound to get misunderstanding, and this is a very healthy thing if you dig into it, because it's through misunderstanding that you actually develop more innovative ideas. You analyze things more, you're forced to explain things in a different way. And I think this is very good for security because a management person will look at the problem from a different angle to the CISO necessarily. And so by homing in on this sort of misunderstanding of what's going wrong, you develop a more mature appreciation of what the problem is. And quite often it can give you a better way of dealing with it.
Indeed, but that comes with communication. So one has not to give up on the moment where it becomes frustrating, they don't get it. No, this is part of the process to grow. Many organizations would look for a shortcut. and we have seen this again. I'm going to refer to NIS, but the other major legislation for all diverse types of sector on cybersecurity often refers to ISO standard 27001 as presumption of compliance, which means presumption of conformity. If you have certification, that means for the regulator, you comply with the given regulation. How does Dora stand on ISO 27001? Would a certification show that a company is compliant with Dora too?
Probably not. I mean, look, it's not a bad thing to have such a certification, but I have to put a lot of caveat emptors around this. Again, I think this is a very problematic area at the moment in cybersecurity, and people are relying far too heavily on certifications without knowing necessarily what they really mean. So the problem with something like ISO 27001 is it can be something which is rubbish in, rubbish out if you're not very careful with the way you do it. Because at the end of the day, ISO 27001 is a methodology for formalizing risks and how to deal with them. And that comes from your own basic knowledge as an organization, plus some experts, of course, to help you on how to deal with them. So and it's the same for people skills. Getting people in with certification is great, but what does certification tell you? And I have a lot of, I respect these people a lot who have these certifications, but it's knowledge. It's not necessarily experience. So companies have to think very seriously about, what they're investing in and what it really brings them. So my answer would be, by all means, do ISO 27001. It's a very good thing. Don't rely on it too heavily and do it sensibly. A lot of organizations will spend an enormous amount of effort trying to get through the certification, and then they'll sort of go, whew, that's done, now we can do something else, and they go away and forget about it. But that is not the way it works. If you haven't got a system which is well integrated into your company, which is not a burden to keep going, and that you can really use it on a day-to-day basis and keep it up to date, then you've done a great job. If you just get through the audit and when the next audit comes years later, you have to scramble like hell to make the thing work, then you've got problems. So I really have a maxim, which I've learned over 30 years. There is no shortcut in cybersecurity. The more you think about it, the better your solution will be. People are afraid to think about it. I don't think they should be. In everyday life, we learn about risks, we learn how to deal with them. We know when we're crossing the road what we need to do. It's built into our nature. We need to build into our way of doing things a sort of innate way of dealing with electronic risk. It's not so hard as people think, but yes, you do have to think. You can't just rely on fixes which come from the marketplace. It doesn't work.
Indeed, if I can also use a metaphor of a car, right? Even if it's electric car, you would think, okay, the most important thing is the battery to get the car.
It's the driver.
In the future, hopefully it will be less important. Driver skills for the safety. But what I wanted to say is that eventually ISO implementing it, not necessarily certification, but implementing it properly, the ISMS, Information Security Management System, would give you either the battery or the engine. Depends how well you set it up. But a car won't move just with a battery or an engine. You need tires to hit the road. You need a steering wheel to be there to steer it continuously. You need a person behind, potentially, at least to start the engine. But you also need all the safety measures, precautions that the rear mirrors. You need to see what is going on, but not only in front, not when you crash. Okay, I've seen the crash, but you also want to see what is coming behind you. Is there something catching up with you? So you also have to look at history. You need to look at logs. It's a lot more, let's say, activities surrounding the engine, and you could use the engine. Of course, you need it to drive, but it's not the only thing. It's not sufficient. You have to build the car around it. And I hope many of our viewers are from our generation that we actually like to drive. So enjoy the ride as well, and get security advisor or consultant like Steve to help you enjoy it better, so you avoid all the car roadblocks, all the small stones that you could have avoided by learning from experience. Thank you, Steve, for sharing your knowledge, and stay tuned with us for future content.